Hey, greetings everybody. Today we're going to be looking at Salutary Neglect, Massachusetts, and the Puritans. Right, so the essay prompt that we'll be focusing on throughout these concepts that you'll be expected to write an essay on is define and discuss salutary neglect. In your discussion, show the development of New Plymouth and how it represents the principles of salutary neglect. Finally, define Puritanism and the objectives of Congregationalist Puritans in Massachusetts Bay, and how salutary neglect was challenged. So that's the overarching essay prompt. In this clip, we're going to be focusing on some introductory information dealing with the development of Plymouth and later Massachusetts and what Puritans were. So, to be a Puritan in the 16th and 17th century was not a simple affair. It was not clear-cut, and there's really no way of generalizing it. There was no formal education. There was no political party. There was not even a church called the Puritan Church. It was mainly a derogatory term from those who thought these people were a little extreme in their efforts to reform the Anglican Church. What the Puritan movement was, it was a social movement that was not clearly defined and often underground and revolutionary. In many ways, it was a movement aimed at recovering a, quote, lost way of life, communal values. It's important to understand during this age, this is the beginning of the age of empire and of Western Europe getting tied into a larger global market, and so things are changing at an accelerated rate. Something we're familiar with today. I mean, today things are moving real fast, and so, but for the people living at this time, the acceleration of change was quite substantial. The leaders of the movement never used the term Puritan. In fact, this was a word that most critics would use at the time. Puritanism originated in England in the mid-1500s when a group of religious reformers sought to purify the Church of England of bishops, church courts, and other remnants of Catholicism. The English crown, which under Henry VIII had renounced Catholicism and replaced it with the Anglican Church. The Anglican Church, or the Church of England as it came to be called, retained many aspects of Roman Catholic theology and ceremony. During Queen Elizabeth's reign, from 1558 to 1603, a noticeable trend toward Protestant doctrine and ceremony developed. By the time King James I, from 1603 to 1625, came to the throne, some Englishmen were content with the Anglican Church as it was. Others hoped to reintroduce much of the rituals and some of the tenets of Catholicism, although they had no desire to return to papal control. And still others took an extreme Protestant position. The extreme Protestant position were called Puritans because they wanted to purify the Anglican Church even further. With official Anglican doctrine, the Puritans had no quarrel, but they wished to do away with bishops, deans, and all clergy above the rank of parish priests, and to abolish set prayers and to reorganize the church either by a hierarchy of councils, which would have been the Presbyterians, or on the basis of a free federation of independent parishes, which would have been the Congregationalists. The Puritans were mostly members of the urban class, engaged in trade and commerce, that resented King James's arbitrary and illegal taxation and wanted to secure laws for the protection and expansion of English commercial interests. Puritans all agreed on what was wrong with the Anglican Church, but they disagreed on how to make it right. They all relied on the Bible for guidance, and they all extracted different opinions from it about how God wanted his churches to be run, of course. Consequently, by the late 1500s, early 1600s, Puritanism was divided into three main groups. One, you had the Presbyterians, who wanted central authority of hierarchy of councils and accepted all comers of the faith. They made no distinction between, quote, visible saints or true believers and inhabitants as Congregationalists did. The Congregationalists were organized into independent parishes, with each congregation governing itself, but with state-supported religion, and was made up of only true believers or visible saints versus inhabitants. The Congregationalists wanted to purify the church from within, but later established the colony of Massachusetts Bay for religious reasons, as internal improvements were found to be impossible in the Old World. The Separatists were the most radical of the groups. They felt the church could not be purified from within, and to support such a corrupt institution was like shaking hands with the devil, they believed. Thus, they wanted to separate their own and form their own church. The Separatists also felt that each congregation had the right to completely govern itself, and thus rejected the idea of state-imposed religion. And so this would be the early remnants of the concept of separation of church and state. The two leading religious sects in England were the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists, and both took much of their theological beliefs from John Calvin. Some of the Separatists were the smallest group within the Puritan movement, and they were considered the most dangerous by the crown because, they were radical. They didn't believe the state had any say in what the church should do, and each church should be an independent church of and within itself. So, with the continued growth of the Separatists in England, the Anglican Church and governmental authorities became quite hostile towards the movement. Consequently, between 1608 and 1609, many of the Separatists fled to the Netherlands, where they eked out a pretty hard living. After living in the Netherlands for some time, many of the Separatists feared that they were losing their distinct identity, as their children were losing contact with their native English culture, and they themselves were prevented from participating in Dutch guilds or their type of union system. With these problems, plus the fear that Spain, a Catholic country, might conquer the Netherlands, it led many Separatists, among them William Bradford, who would later become governor of the colony, to organize a movement and go to the New World where they might have more favorable conditions. Money presented the major obstacle to their plans, so they petitioned for a land patent and a loan from the Virginia Company of London, which was the same company that founded Jamestown. So this was the destination right here, if you see me pointing right here, for the original Puritans, the Chesapeake Bay in Virginia. So according to the terms with the Virginia Company of London, the contract that was drawn up, they would accompany a body of non-pilgrims on a voyage to some of the unclaimed lands of Virginia, and the company would also advance them £700. In return, the colonists would work 7 years, essentially being indentured servants for the Virginia Company. At the end of the time, all the profits derived from fishing or trading would be divided between the settlers and the merchants. On September 16th, 1620, the Mayflower settled with 101 people for the New World. A baby was born, and so they arrived with 102 people, not in Virginia, but all the way up here in Cape Cod, modern-day Massachusetts. So this is where they were supposed to be. This is where they ended up, right? And they ended up there November 11th, 1620, so they were a little bit late, and it was too late to plant crops, so they had a difficult time ahead of them. So what happened was a storm set them off course, and this is a significant consequences. It's going to have significant consequences, this unexpected landing up here instead of down here. This area was outside the domain of the Virginia Company, obviously. This is a long way off, right? And consequently, settlers became, well, essentially squatters. They were without legal right to the land and without specific authority to establish a government. A serious matter, since some sailors were not pilgrims. Since some of the sailors were not pilgrims, they threatened mutiny. So before disembarking off the boat, in order to avoid anarchy, 41 men agreed to the Mayflower Compact, which stated it was basically a quote, a covenant, and combined ourselves together into a civil body politic. So this is the beginning of the Mayflower Compact. Consequently, a contract or a social compact voluntarily drawn up by the settlers themselves became the foundation of government in early Plymouth. Every member had a right to vote for the governor and his assistants, which meant that everyone had a voice in determining policy. Hence, the Mayflower Compact stands with the Virginia Assembly of 1619 as the foundation to our basic principle of self-government. So very, very early on, this idea of self-government, which is really incredibly radical during this time. The seeds of self-government in the House of Burgesses and the Mayflower Compact were products of the constitutional evolution within England, which dated back all the way to the Magna Carta of 1215. These transplanted ideas were eventually to be modified and molded into institutions, in some cases so distinctly as to become American institutions in themselves, completely separate and quite different from institutions in England, specifically Great Britain. The Compact was the foundation of the colony's government and served as such until 1686, when the king combined the colony with the rest of New England in a vast new colony called the Dominion of New England. We'll talk more about that later. Plymouth never received a charter from the king since they were kind of squatters and off course. It's important to understand when they landed here in 1620 up here, nobody knew where they were. Right? They just disappeared. This is before texting. So they were just out here. So there was no charter. They landed here and they created the Mayflower Compact and they kind of did things on their own. So Plymouth never received this charter from the king. However, the Council for New England, which had control over the area by way of charter from the king, did grant a patent for title in the land in 1621, giving each settler 100 acres. But the boundaries of the patents were never spelt out during this time. The fact that the colonists from Plymouth Colony were able to govern themselves is incredibly significant. And this time period, again, lasted from, let me write that down just to make sure this is emphasized, from 1620 to 1686. This is the introductory formative years of basically New England, from the standpoint of the Puritans. So the fact that they were able to govern themselves demonstrates a good deal of neglect on the part of England in administrating the colonies. It's because of this neglect and other situations that will be discussed later that the period from Jamestown in 1607 down here in this area, 1607, until the end of Salutary Neglect with the French Indian War of 1763. Right? So during this time period, you have basically English colonies on their own. The phase of salutary neglect is justified in describing this period because all of the colonies within a relatively short period of time were able to become virtually independent, acknowledging allegiances to whatever authority had control in England, but making their own laws, trading where they pleased, defending themselves without help from home, and working out and developing their own institutions and value system. The significance of this period is that it allowed the American Revolution as an evolutionary process to take place. It is during this time that the colonists in Virginia, Georgia, New Plymouth, and the rest of England's continental colonies were developing their own economic, political, and social and cultural identities. This new identity was a reflection of a new set of values and new ways of doing things that led to the development of new institutions that were emerging from the colonies themselves. And this can be exemplified in several ways. First, the colonial practice of annual elections is important to understand here. So let's put this under. Let me explain later what geographical representation is in just a second, but let's put it under here. You have one annual elections, which we find quite normal, but this is quite radical. And during annual elections, all officers, governors, as well as colonial legislations would be elected on a definite date. Right? This practice became popular throughout the colonies and still survives in our own federal government today, with elections for presidents, senators, and representatives on the same day. Next, in the area of representation, the differences were significant. In order to hold office in the colonies, a man had to be a landowner on a freeholder in the colony, county, or town where he was running. So this is known as geographical representation. I'm going to put this up here. All right. So geographical representation is what we have today, right? For the most part, in order to run for senator in Texas, you have to live in Texas, right? This is incredibly radical at the time because England had what was called virtual representation, right, as opposed to geographical representation. What virtual representation is it's representation of classes and interests of the empire citizens rather than on localities, right? The concept held that since all of the interests of the empire's citizens were considered in Parliament, all were therefore virtually representative in that forum. It made little difference that the number of Englishmen did not actually elect representatives to Parliament. This was irrelevant because members of that body represented not the concerns of individuals or localities, but rather the interests of the nation and of the empire as a whole, right? And so this difference here between geographical representation, which develops throughout British America during its development, versus virtual representation is going to lead to the revolution, to the Revolutionary War, to the War for Independence. It's one of the factors. Because of salutary neglect, basically Great Britain kind of leaving these people alone, they developed virtual geographical representation. And so the tenet concern of colonists during the Revolution of 1776 is that they didn't have a seat in Parliament. And so when King George and Parliament of that time begin to pass new taxes and enforce pre-existing taxes, they're going to claim, well, we're willing to pay these taxes if we can send people to Parliament to represent our own interests, which is a foreign concept to people living in England who have virtual representation, right? So real important concept to understand. Oops, where was I? Let's see. Oh, okay. And so, here we go. All right, we'll finish up right. Hence, American institutions began to diverge from England institutions right from the get-go. The divergence occurred during the formative stage in colonial development, thereby allowing the colonists to develop their own way of doing things. This had a major impact in the decade after 1763, when the period of salutary neglect had ended, and England tried to enforce its institutions on the colonies after 1763. We're going to talk more about that later in the next lecture. But salutary neglect, the formative years for Massachusetts are 1620 to 1686. For all of British America, for all of this time, salutary neglect is going to last from, let me just write this down so we have it here, just for ways of introductory period here. Oops. So salutary neglect is going to last from 1607 with the founding of Jamestown to 1763 with the end of the French Indian War, and we'll talk more about that later. But to conclude here, a statement from John Adams to Thomas Jefferson in 1818, who was they were quite elderly at this time. He was reflecting back on the development growth of the colonies. He described the process as such. But what do we mean by the American Revolution? Do we mean the American War? The Revolution was effected before the war commenced. The Revolution was in the minds, in the hearts of the people. This radical change in the principles, opinions, sentiments, and affections of the people was the real American Revolution. So we'll leave it at that, and I'll see you guys in the next concept. Let me know if you have any questions or concerns by either emailing me or talking to me in class. Talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.